The fall in Boston is beautiful. It's the season when the street trees turn red and yellow, reflecting their vibrant colors on the surface of the Charles River. Margaret Hamilton glanced at the scenery through her office window while concentrating on finishing her final report. On her desk at the finance department of Hamilton Builders, documents were neatly stacked. "Margaret, are the materials for tomorrow's board meeting ready?" When she turned around, her stepfather, Chairman Richard Hamilton, was standing there. His back was straight, exuding the dignity of a man who ran one of the top 5 construction companies in Boston. "Yes, I'm just doing the final check," Margaret answered with a smile. "I've compiled everything, including the third-quarter earnings report and the forecast analysis for next year." As expected of my daughter, Richard nodded with satisfaction. Even though they weren't related by blood, he always called her that. "Without you, this company wouldn't run smoothly." Margaret had lost her father 10 years ago, and when her mother Judith remarried 2 years later, she had already graduated from college. She had mixed feelings at first, but she was grateful that Richard treasured her mother and welcomed her as a daughter. And now, she had become an important member of his company. "We have a family dinner tonight, don't we? What time should I be home?" Margaret asked, checking her watch. "Try to be home by 7. "Caitlin will be back from school," Richard said. "As you know, she wants to talk about her college applications." Caitlin was Margaret's sister, whom Margaret had looked after since Caitlin was born. Caitlin had now grown into a beautiful young woman. Because of their age difference, Margaret sometimes took on a motherly role, but to Margaret, Caitlin was a precious treasure of the family. "I understand," Margaret replied. "I'm looking forward to seeing which college she chooses." As she watched Richard leave the office, Margaret took a deep breath. In fact, she herself was about to make a major decision. She took an envelope from her desk drawer and checked its contents once more. "Dear Margaret Hamilton, we are pleased to inform you of your admission to the London Business School." She had been thinking for 2 weeks since receiving this letter about how to tell her family. This opportunity for career advancement meant studying abroad in London for 3 years. It meant leaving the company and being far away from her family. In the evening, Margaret returned to her parents' home in the upscale Beacon Hill neighborhood, carrying shopping bags in both hands. When she opened the front door, she heard Judith's voice from the kitchen. "Margaret? Perfect timing. Could you help me make the salad?" "Of course, Mom." Margaret put down her bags and headed to the kitchen. Judith had her grayish blonde hair tied up and emanated elegance even in an apron. Margaret learned cooking tips from her mother while preparing mentally for her big announcement tonight. "Is Caitlin not back yet?" "She'll be home soon. She was watching a movie with friends," Judith answered. Soon, the whole family gathered around the dining table. Caitlin was spreading out college brochures, talking enthusiastically. "I'm planning to apply to Harvard and MIT. But I can't rule out New York University either." "They're all wonderful schools," Margaret smiled, gazing at her sister's passionate expression. "You'll shine wherever you go." As dinner was coming to an end, Margaret placed her glass on the table and took a deep breath. "Everyone, I have something to tell you." The room grew quiet. 3 pairs of eyes turned to Margaret. "I've received an acceptance letter from the London Business School. It's a 3-year program." After a moment of silence, Richard stood up. Margaret had prepared herself for opposition, but her stepfather placed his hand on her shoulder and gave her a warm smile. "Congratulations. That's wonderful news. But the company?" "Don't worry about the company," Richard said. "Your future is what matters. Go ahead, the company will be waiting here. When you come back, you can make the company even better with your new knowledge." Judith and Caitlin also stood up and embraced Margaret. With her family's support, her heart was filled with hope. With scholarships, her own savings, and help from her family, her new life in London would begin. "I'll do my best. When I return in 3 years, I'll be someone you can all be proud of," Margaret promised. A foggy morning in London. Margaret opened the curtains of her flat and gazed at the sunrise of her final day. Her 3-year study abroad was ending, and today she would return to Boston. On her desk lay her business master's degree certificate, completed with excellent grades. "I can finally go home," she whispered softly. During the first year, she had video calls with her family almost every week. Judith was eager to hear all about her new life, and Caitlin enthusiastically talked about her college life. Richard always smiled, saying, "The company is doing fine, don't worry." But as she entered the second year, the frequency of these calls decreased, and in the last 6 months, she had barely been able to contact them. When Margaret called, she only received brief replies like, "Everyone's busy," without getting any details. Still, she tried to understand, thinking, they must be busy with final exams, or it must be the company's fiscal closing period. After vacating her apartment and completing final checks for the long journey, Margaret headed to Heathrow Airport. Her luggage was packed with gifts for her family, a scarf for her mother, whiskey for Richard, and a bag from a famous British designer for Caitlin. "I'm sure they'll love these." After a 7-hour flight, Margaret arrived at Boston Logan International Airport and took a deep breath. This place smelled like home. She got into a taxi and gave the unchanged address of her old home. "Beacon Hill, 17 Mount Vernon Street, please." As the taxi headed into the city, Margaret looked at the scenery outside the window. Boston after 3 years looked somewhat different. New buildings had been constructed, and her favorite cafe had closed. But that was probably just the natural evolution of the city. "Once I get home, everything will be as it always was," she told herself. However, as the taxi entered the residential area, Margaret began to feel a slight sense of unease. Something different from usual. Beacon Hill, where her family home was located, was an upscale neighborhood, and the streets should have been well maintained, but something seemed off. "Must be my imagination." Margaret shook her head to dismiss her anxiety. As the taxi turned onto Mount Vernon Street, the driver asked, "Number 17, is that right?" "Yes, this is it." Margaret paid the fare and got out with her heavy suitcase. After the taxi drove away, she stood looking up at what had been her home. As she approached the house, her sense of unease grew stronger. The lawn in the front yard, once well maintained, was now overgrown, and the rose bushes her mother had cherished were withering. An unfamiliar black SUV was parked in the driveway. Her father's beloved sedan was nowhere to be seen, nor was Richard's truck. Did they move? But I didn't get any notice. Margaret tilted her head in confusion as she approached the entrance. The door color had changed from deep green to navy blue, and a new brass mailbox had been installed. Looking at the nameplate, it read, "Johnson, not Hamilton." Her heart began to race. Margaret hurriedly took the house key from her handbag, but the keyhole was different. "This is strange." She rang the doorbell. Even the chime sound had changed. She waited for a while, but there was no answer. She called her mother on her cell phone, but all she heard was the message, "The number you have dialed is not in service." As her anxiety grew, the door of the neighboring house opened, and old Mrs. Sheila appeared. "Margaret?" Sheila looked at her with an expression of disbelief. "You're back." "But..." "Hello, Sheila. Has something happened to my family?" Sheila approached Margaret with a confused expression still on her face. "Don't you know? They moved out 2 weeks ago. There was some big commotion." "Moved? But I didn't get any notice." Margaret couldn't hide her distress. "Don't you know their new address?" Sheila shook her head apologetically. "I'm sorry. I only saw them moving their things out. Richard was in such a hurry, he wasn't in a state to talk to." Judith looked pale too. Margaret was confused. Why hadn't her family told her about the move? Why had they moved just before her return to the country? Wait a minute, Sheila suddenly said. Your belongings. Sheila pointed toward the garden. Following her gaze, Margaret saw a pile of cardboard boxes stacked in the corner of the backyard, behind the house. Some items were sticking out of the rain-soaked boxes. Upon closer inspection, they were indeed her possessions. Photo albums from her college days, books she had collected since childhood, mementos of her biological father. All were damaged from exposure to rain and dew. This is. Margaret was at a loss for words. In her state of bewilderment, her smartphone rang. Looking at the screen, she saw a notification from the family group chat. The chat that had barely made a sound for 3 years was suddenly active again. At that moment, her eyes caught something on the entrance of what used to be her home. A piece of paper saying, "No trespassing, violators will be prosecuted," was attached to the door. And above it, a colorful banner fluttered in the wind. Congratulations, Caitlin, on your acceptance to Harvard University. Margaret read those words over and over, desperately trying to understand their meaning as she unlocked her phone with trembling fingers. There was a new message in the family group chat. The attached photo showed Caitlin, Judith, and Richard smiling. Caitlin was wearing a Harvard University hoodie and proudly holding up her acceptance letter. And below that was a message from Richard. Margaret, you don't need to come back anymore. For Caitlin's college education, you should disappear. I've stopped the scholarship. Live your own life. Margaret couldn't take her eyes off the screen. It seemed like a bad joke, but these cruel words were actually there. She read them over and over, trying to comprehend their meaning. What does this mean? After a long silence, Sheila gently placed her hand on Margaret's shoulder. Come inside and have some tea. You're shaking. Margaret nodded vaguely and walked to the neighboring house. Sitting at Sheila's dining table with a warm cup of tea in her hands, she regained some composure. Thank you, Sheila. I can't understand what's happening at all. Sheila looked at her with sympathetic eyes. I don't know the details, but about 2 weeks ago, there was a big argument late at night. I could hear Judith crying and screaming, and Richard shouting. The next day, movers came and hastily carried out their belongings. Margaret gazed out the window at what was once her home. It had started to rain, and she could see her belongings in the garden getting even wetter. I need to go get my things. Margaret stood up, borrowed an umbrella from Sheila, and went outside. In the garden of what used to be her home, she checked each cardboard box one by one. Photos from her childhood, her college diploma, mementos of her biological father, all were wet from the rain, and some photos were already soaked and faded. Particularly heartbreaking was the last photo with her biological father. In a frame with broken glass, the smiling father and daughter were wet with raindrops. Tears flowed from Margaret's eyes, mingling with the raindrops. While gathering her belongings, she tried calling her mother again. This time the call went through, but her mother's voice was cold. Margaret, stop calling us. What's happening? Why did you move? Why are my belongings in the garden? Questions poured out one after another. After a brief silence, Judith answered in a tired voice. It's as Richard says. Don't contact us anymore. Think about Caitlin's future. What about Caitlin? What have I done? Margaret's voice was anguished. You're not family anymore. Richard decided that. The call suddenly ended. Margaret stood there in disbelief. Her own mother had abandoned her. As she lined up the wet boxes, a notification for an email appeared on her smartphone. Opening it, she saw it was from the London Business School Scholarship Foundation. Due to the withdrawal of your guarantor, the remaining financial support has been terminated. Additionally, you will need to repay the funds already provided within the specified period. Margaret sat down on the spot. During her previous study abroad, it wasn't fully funded, half was a scholarship loan, with Richard as the guarantor. This meant he had not only withdrawn as guarantor but had also burdened her with an enormous debt. Why? As if to answer her soliloquy, a new notification appeared on her smartphone. This time it was from the bank. Her account had been frozen because Richard was registered as a joint account holder. The rain intensified, soaking Margaret's body and chilling her heart. Amid all this, she noticed an unfamiliar man standing in front of the house. "Miss, this is private property. Please leave." "I'm just retrieving my belongings," Margaret desperately explained. "Please leave promptly before I call the police. The Johnson family does not want you entering." The man had clearly been instructed by the new homeowners. Feeling the humiliation of being evicted from her own home, Margaret carried some wet boxes back to Sheila's house. "Oh, you poor thing," Sheila said. "Stay here tonight. Tomorrow, we'll think of a solution." Margaret thanked Sheila for her kindness. However, her heart was full of confusion and despair. The degree she had worked so hard to earn over 3 years. But now, she had no home, no savings, and no family. All she had was an enormous debt and the mementos she had rescued from her former home. After showering and changing, Margaret sat on the bed in the borrowed room and finally had the composure to think calmly. What she needed now was stable housing and a job. She had to take action starting tomorrow. Amid all this, her smartphone rang again. This time it was a message from her sister Caitlin. Margaret opened it nervously. "Sis, I'm sorry. Dad says it's better for the family if you're not around." But actually, the message cut off there. Margaret waited for a continuation, but nothing more came. What did her sister want to say? Or had someone stopped her? "Caitlin." Tears flowed from Margaret's eyes. Amid mixed feelings of anger and sadness, she questioned herself. Why did Richard suddenly expel me? Why didn't Mom defend me? And what was Caitlin trying to say? The questions were endless, but there were no answers. Outside the window, the rain continued to fall, and the lights of Boston flickered through the raindrops. On Margaret's smartphone screen, the photo of the 3 family members smiling and the message rejecting her were still displayed. That night, Margaret couldn't sleep. She asked herself over and over in her mind, what should I do now? She couldn't find an answer, but one thing was certain. There was no going back. From tomorrow, she would have to start a new life. Exhausted, she curled up on the bed and cried like a child. But even in those tears, a small fire of determination began to light. Never again will I let anyone take away my life. With that vow in her heart, she waited for the long, painful night to end. I'm sorry, but we're not looking for someone like you. Margaret heard the same words after her 5th interview. Boston's construction industry was narrower than she had thought, and Richard Hamilton's influence was far-reaching. Just hearing her name, she could see the interviewer's expressions cloud over. Richard Hamilton's daughter. I'm sorry, but... The words were vague, but the meaning was clear. No one wanted to hire her. 2 weeks after leaving Sheila's house, Margaret was able to rent a small apartment. It was a cramped studio far from Beacon Hill, in the suburbs of Boston. The view from the window was just a brick wall, and while the rent was cheap, her remaining meager savings were rapidly diminishing. At this rate, I won't last a month. Margaret contemplated her next move as she stared at the cardboard boxes piled in her room. The biggest problem was the repayment of the scholarship loan. With Richard withdrawing as guarantor, the full amount was being demanded for immediate repayment. That amount was far beyond what she could pay in her current situation. She desperately needed a job. I have a master's degree from the London Business School, she said as she handed her resume to a coffee shop manager. The manager frowned. To be honest, you're overqualified. But do you have experience as a barista? No, but I learn quickly. From that day on, Margaret Hamilton began working as a barista at a coffee shop in Central Square under the name Maggie. The irony of an MBA holder brewing coffee. But she had no choice. On her first payday, Margaret sat at a small desk and kept a household account. After deducting rent, food, and transportation, the amount she could allocate to scholarship repayment was minimal. At this rate, it would take over 10 years to fully repay. I need to think of another way. She worked at the coffee shop during the day and spent her nights with management books she brought home and online financial analysis tools. Sticky notes were attached to the walls of her apartment, with business ideas written on them. She was desperately searching for ways to use the knowledge she had gained in her MBA program. A month passed, and Margaret began to remember the faces and names of the coffee shop's regular customers. Lawyers who came before their morning commute, groups of college students at noon, and a man who always opened his laptop at the window seat in the evening. The usual dark roast, please. One evening, that regular customer ordered. The man in the suit appeared to be in his early 40s, with sharp eyes beneath a tired expression. Here you go, David, Margaret smiled as she handed him the coffee. You remember my name? The man, David Clark, seemed a bit surprised. I remember all my regulars' names and preferences, Margaret replied. It's the basics of business. The basics of business. David showed interest. Is this not your first time working in a coffee shop? After a moment's hesitation, Margaret answered honestly. Actually, I just earned my MBA in London. But this is my job now. David's eyes lit up. That's interesting. Could you tell me more? If you don't mind. After closing the shop that day, Margaret joined David for a late dinner at the diner across from the coffee shop. He was the CEO of a tech startup called FutureBridge Technologies. Our company primarily develops software, but we've recently started to expand into digital solutions for the construction industry. To be honest, we don't have anyone familiar with the inner workings of that industry. Margaret's heart rate increased. This was her area of expertise. Actually, I worked at Hamilton Builders for 10 years. In the finance department. Hamilton Builders. David was surprised. Richard Hamilton's company. Margaret nodded briefly. She didn't want to talk much about her past. I won't ask for details. David didn't miss the change in her expression. But if you're interested, would you work as a consultant for our company? Part-time is fine. That offer was a lifeline for Margaret. She began a double life, barista by day, consultant by night. She provided insider knowledge of the construction industry to David's company while learning about the latest technologies. 3 months later, Margaret became a full-time employee at FutureBridge and was promoted to Director of Finance. Her innovative ideas and financial knowledge were bringing significant profits to the company. In particular, the digital transformation project for the construction industry was a great success. Margaret, thanks to you, we're becoming leaders in the construction tech field, David praised her achievements in the conference room. In fact, I'd like to appoint you as the person in charge of a new project. A new project? Yes, a digital accounting system for major construction companies. It will be an even bigger deal than before. Margaret jumped at the opportunity. She worked day and night, mobilizing all her knowledge to make the project successful. The digital accounting system was adopted by many construction companies, and the name FutureBridge became known in the industry. And then, a year and a half after her expulsion, Margaret called David to her office and made a proposal. We've been successful in the digital transformation of the construction industry. But we can do something bigger. What do you mean? Let's create an independent consulting division. A subsidiary that provides digital transformation services specialized for the construction industry. David was impressed by her proposal. Thus, Next Level Consulting was born. Margaret became the CEO, and David became an investor and advisor. 6 months after the company was established, Margaret repaid her scholarship loan in full. She moved from her small apartment to a spacious high-rise condominium overlooking the Charles River. She had rebuilt her life from nothing through her own strength. One night, Margaret was on the balcony of her condominium, reflecting on the past 2 years as she gazed at the night view. If I hadn't been thrown out by my family that day, I might not have walked this path. She smiled wryly. Ironically, Richard's cruel act had led her to a new path of success. David stood next to her with a glass in hand. Their relationship was gradually becoming more than just business partners. Thinking about something? Yes, just a bit, Margaret smiled. Life is so unpredictable. As David was about to say something, Margaret's smartphone rang. She picked it up and answered, though it was from an unknown number. Hello, this is Margaret Hamilton. Miss Hamilton, it's been a while, it was an unfamiliar man's voice. I'm Thomas Green, a reporter from the Boston Business Journal. I'd like to get your comment on the current state of Hamilton Builders. Margaret was surprised. Hamilton Builders? Why me? Don't you know? The reporter seemed surprised. The company is in a major management crisis. It's said to be caused by Richard Hamilton's reckless investments. 3 years later, Margaret was gazing at the view through the window from her office in a high-rise building. The Next Level Consulting sign shone at the entrance, and her company was now attracting attention as the fastest-growing consulting firm in Boston. The final check of the contract is complete. David entered the office. He was now more than just a business partner. They had become partners in both work and private life. Thank you, Margaret smiled. Now everything is in order. On her desk were spread investigation documents related to Hamilton Builders. Richard's company was laden with enormous debt and on the verge of bankruptcy. Information had also come in that they were desperately trying to raise funds to save the company. The investigation revealed that Richard had spent the company's funds on reckless investments and luxurious living while she was studying abroad. Furthermore, he had ignored the sound financial systems she had built in the finance department, and there were many opaque points in the accounting process. Do you think Richard will jump at the anonymous proposal from Phoenix Investment? David asked. Margaret stood up, closing the file. He has no choice. Bankruptcy, or accept our proposal. Phoenix Investment was an investment company that Margaret and David had established for a special purpose. They had made an anonymous acquisition proposal to Hamilton Builders. The conditions seemed generous at first glance, but included the right to appoint a new CEO and the demotion of the current management. A week later, a meeting was set in a conference room at a luxury hotel downtown for the contract signing. Margaret was dressed in a silk blouse and tailored suit, with her long hair elegantly arranged. When she entered the conference room, Richard, the directors, and the lawyers were waiting. Richard's face changed when he noticed her. Why are you here? His voice trembled with anger and confusion. I am the CEO of Phoenix Investment, Margaret replied calmly. And from today, I'm also the new CEO of Hamilton Builders. The room fell silent. Richard's face turned bright red. This is ridiculous. I'm canceling the contract. The lawyer cleared his throat. That's impossible, Mr. Hamilton. It's already been pre-signed, and the penalty would certainly bankrupt the company. Margaret opened the contract. According to this contract, you can remain with the company. Not as a department head, but as a regular employee. Rather than giving my company to you. Your company? Margaret's voice sharpened. You mean the company you've nearly bankrupted? The company my father built and I supported for 10 years. The door to the conference room opened, and Judith and Caitlin were standing there. Margaret had called them. Mom. Caitlin. Richard said weakly. Richard, that's enough, Judith said with a tired expression. You've ruined everything. Margaret glanced at her mother and sister before turning back to Richard. You threw me out for Caitlin's success, didn't you? Now it's my turn. She took a pen and signed the final contract. Welcome to the new Hamilton Builders.